Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Happy New Year to all of you, and welcome to our first Kaffeepause of 2023. Each week, we check in with a Berlin-based journalist to talk about emerging stories that are shaping the headlines in Germany. So this morning, or this afternoon, if you're in Germany, I hope that you have a cup of coffee at the ready for our conversation with Bloomberg Opinion columnist Andreas Kluth, who was previously editor-in-chief of Handelsblatt Global and a writer for The Economist. Hello, Andreas. Welcome back to the Kaffeepause and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, Steve.
So I am very excited about starting the new year with you. This has almost become a tradition. We did the same thing last year. Of course, you and I have spoken since then on the Kaffeepause, but it was actually the 10th of January of last year that we started the year. And I thought that maybe we could begin by looking back at last year before we look ahead to this year, because certainly when you and I spoke in January of 2022, I don't think we would have imagined quite the way that the year unfolded. Obviously, we saw a new government in Berlin. This government has had a steep learning curve. There have been external challenges, not least COVID, not least of which is COVID, but of course the war in Ukraine, the major policy pivot introduced by Olaf Scholz with his Zeitenwende speech, and of course energy concerns as a result of the war in Ukraine, and a host of other topics and issues. So I thought I'd maybe start by asking you to reflect on the first full year for the Ampelkoalition, right, the traffic light coalition of three parties under the leadership of Olaf Scholz, and then we can sort of look ahead to what the year 2023 might hold.
Well, it's really sort of not fair to take, to go into government and then have this thrown at you. I mean, it's because even in the 16 years before, Merkel had these four governments and four, coalitions, and was constantly managing crises to the extent that people like me called her crisis management. I mean, that became her personality. But this sort of obviously, we're talking about the invasion by Russia, by Putin of Ukraine, of course, that completely ruined. They're still quoting the contract, the coalition contract they had just signed a few months before the invasion started. But of course, as of February 24th, 2022, you could rip that up, throw it out. And that's the fate of the German government is not the most important thing about this. The whole world was in this completely new era. And by the way, one contribution Olaf Scholz made to historiography is to coin a word, because it's a long German word. It seems to fit perfectly, and it's Zeitenwende or Zeitenwende, whatever you want. But a watershed, a turning point. Basically, it's a new era. He just on the Sunday after the invasion started, he went to the Bundestag and gave a speech that surprised many of us, including me, and coined that word, which as yet, and to some extent still, has almost no content, or what it means is another thing. But he proclaimed it. I did for example, a TikTok video about the word of the year. It is the word of the year in Germany. There's several words of the year, and so he fit the perfect. He got the perfect tag for it, because it is a completely new world, and this new government had just entered, taken their seats around the cabinet table when it started. And so the fact that maybe the polls don't look good for them, on the other hand, they don't look great either. In a year like this, what could one possibly expect? And Germany is not in the front row of this contest between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West, but it is in the second row. And maybe And of course, the expectations have long been that Germany should be more of a leader, and that it's not enough of a leader. And in this, and the Zeitenwende comes at that moment of tension, or compounds that tension. It adds urgency to that. And there is a big question mark about many countries, from little ones like Hungary or Turkey. Where do you powers like that? Olaf Scholz is very careful to include states like India, Indonesia. There are question marks over where will countries position themselves, but a big question mark is above Germany. And one thing you can say, because I've mentioned to you often that German politics is very solipsistic. They're very in their own minds. They don't even know what it looks like from the outside. And they weren't ready for this at all.
Mm-hmm.
Given that shock, I think, with the exception of possibly one minister, the defense minister, I think they could have done a lot worse. I mean, they're doing fine. And I certainly will not measure them at all by, are they doing what they promised before? Because it is a different world. We're in a complete, like a black swan of a situation. That's not technically true, because it could have been predictable, the invasion, and they have a lot of processing to do, and I think they're doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we'll get into some of that a little bit later in our conversation, but I think one of the big surprises in the Zeitenwende speech was some of what Olaf Scholz was talking about in terms of defense spending domestically, but also in terms of Germany's willingness to provide military support to Ukraine, right? These are sort of tenets of German foreign policy that he was changing, and move fast forward to where we are today. Macron made an announcement last week, and following that announcement, it looks like France, Germany, and the US will send armored vehicles to Ukraine, and also that it also looks like Germany and the US will step up its air defenses being provided to Ukraine. There's been a lot of debate about Germany providing weapons and armaments to Ukraine, and it now seems clear after months of back and forth that Germany will provide its Marder infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. But this isn't the kind of equipment that Kyiv really wants, right? Germany's Leopard tanks, the U.S. Army's M1 Abrams are more mobile, more accurate. And I guess one of the big questions is, this is perhaps too little, too late, but does it also set a precedent for Germany providing those Leopards in the not too distant future? The Greens have been pretty outspoken about supporting a move in that direction. But can you talk a little bit about A, how this has been perceived in Germany, but B, how you see this unfolding? It's something that you just wrote about over the weekend.
I'd like to take just one step back, because I'm not sure that everyone in the audience watched the Zeitenwende speech. What was it about? And we already said we don't know quite. It's an evolving project. But I'll start with the subtext, how I understood it. What was so amazing, as a reminder, is that the Germans, more than anyone else in the world, lived since reunification, since the end of the Cold War, in sort of this illusion that they're surrounded by friends, that were beyond the military era, that it's kind of troglodyte to think in realist, hard politics terms, and specifically that Russia is a country that the Germans have to atone toward for the crimes of the past, always talk to, always trade more with, and as long as they do that, everything will be fine. And February 24th, that invasion, almost all of Germany's partners have been saying for a long time, 20 years, since Gerhard Schröder and Nord Stream 1, and then since the Crimea annexation of 2014 and Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline that really then was laid after the Crimean annexation. the Poles, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Americans, and even the French and others have been saying, you're wrong. You're doing something crazy. And the Germans said in a very arrogant way, often very like in that solipsistic way, oh, no, you don't understand. We know the Russians. We know how to do this. And the Zeitenwende was essentially the subtext in between every one of Olaf Scholz's line was, we were wrong. And we've got to deal with this. And that's why he was ahead of his audience, the Bundestag, the parliament in front of him. The specifics were that follow from this for Germany, the narrow definition, so not the global, but the German irrelevance was, therefore, we have to finally invest in the Bundeswehr and the army because Germany is spending way below the 2% goal that NATO set itself of GDP on the army, and for years, and will continue, by the way. So he said that's the goal, and to make it happen, let's have a 100 billion euro fund for the military. So that's the one of these aspects. And then he went in, and then he sort of conjugated, or went down the list of energy policy. Because Putin, it was a question, will we say no to Putin's gas and oil and coal, or will he turn off the tap first? And it's sort of both happening at once. But of course, Germany had deliberately made itself independent. So for Germany, it was an about, so then the speech happened, and that was on the Sunday after the invasion. And I hailed it as a revolution, but then very quickly the other allies wanted to know, well, so what are you actually going to do? And then people remembered that was the chancellor saying, I understood this as a turning point, and we have to find a new direction. It was not yet the rest of the country or the rest of the parliament, and certainly not the rest of his party, the Social Democrats, who had been very Russophilic before. And what you've seen is a kind of tug of war since then, as people digest, as the German political class digests the implications. And the first big debate that started immediately after is, so how do we help Ukraine? And then, there were very embarrassing moments earlier because they didn't want to send weapons yet. That conflicted with the traditional German approach to everything. So, for instance, this defense minister, Christine Lambrecht, said, "Oh, we're sending 5,000 helmets," and that became the subject of derision. And but then and I wrote columns, other people criticizing the Germans for not really meaning it, not being a good ally. As a percentage of GDP or per capita, like the Estonians are way ahead, but in absolute terms, the Americans are way, way ahead in terms of humanitarian, economic, and military aid. The Brits have been great, the French have held back, but the Germans, everyone now looked to the Germans, in part because of the speech, in part because of the special responsibility, because the Germans had done so much damage with the pipeline politics and a lot else. It's like, so what are you going to do? And initially, the Germans didn't want to send weapons. And there were a lot of sort of phony debates, like, why aren't you sending weapons? Well, because we don't want to get, go it alone. That's one way of saying it. We need to follow the Americans. We will only do it when all the NATO partners do it too. Well, actually, NATO partners were saying, please, Germany, lead, okay? Then they were saying, well, we'll send defensive weapon, but not offensive weapon, because we don't want to get drawn into World War III. We don't want to be shooting at each other. We don't want to trip over Vladimir Putin's red lines. On the ground in Ukraine, you can't distinguish offensive and defensive, but hence the first ship, it was still a pretty easy decision to send air defense like Iris-T, those systems, and now a Patriot battery. But the Ukrainians have been saying all along, well, what we really need is good main battle tanks. By the way, you said they do want the Marder and the Bradleys and the AMX-10 from France. They need all of this to training. Yeah. But to take back, which is not offensive in my book, to take back their own Ukrainian territories, especially these 4 regions that Putin claims ridiculously to have annexed, they will need to take the fight to the Russians. They cannot just defend the missiles he's sending at the cities. And that penny has essentially dropped, but not throughout and this is where German society, more than some others, is split.
Mhm.
Scholz has done a pretty good job of holding that together. And I started my first column saying, send those main battle tanks called Leopard 2 was in the summer. The Greens, it's an amazing evolution of this formerly pacifist party who found they're the most idealistic party in terms of realism versus idealism in diplomacy in the German spectrum now. And they have become sort of hawkish, okay, more than the Social Democrats. But the Free Democrats, I want to give a shout out to Agnes Strack. No, help me out.
Strack-Zimmermann.
Strack-Zimmermann. By the way, right today, she's landing in Taiwan with someone else from the Free Democrats to show, courage there in showing support vis-a-vis the Chinese. So the Free Democrats and the Greens, they're ahead, and the Social Democrats have been dragging, but so has a large portion of Germany, especially East Germany, and certain well-known philosophers here. They're not sure at all. And so this was the debate. And gradually, whenever the Americans or some other ally has taken another step, the Germans, Scholz has immediately taken another step too. Mm-hmm. And so now we're at this, it wasn't totally coordinated, at least not with the French this week, but now we're at this pretty significant shift where they're armored fighting vehicles. They're not officially tanks, where they're sending the Bradleys, the Martyrs, and the AMX-10. And I think, and I think the principle of caution from Scholz's point of view is, let's see what Putin does then. But I think it leads towards sending the M1 Abrams, maybe the Leclercs, maybe the Brits will send the Challenger, and the Germans the Leopard 2. You have to train them, you have to prepare that, and the timing would be, well, when it gets warmer again in the spring at some point. And of course, the big difference is, in February last year, no one thought it was a question here: would the Ukrainians lose in 2 days or in 4 days? And now it seems, as long as it stays in conventional military conflict, they might win, or at least they will deny Putin victory. So in that context, I think it is, to me, a question of when, not whether, Germany will send Leopard 2s. And even that'll be symbolic, because it'll be more. And then economics. I mean, this will go on for years. And I have to say, Scholz, I would have never chosen him before the election, but he's done a pretty good job of, like his sort of mentor in a way, or he emulates Merkel, of holding things together, given that compared to, let's say, Poland, Germany is more split on these things, and his own party is more split. And I think he's brought it along quite well. And I'm sure they'll be sending these tanks by spring or thereabouts.
So, Andreas, since you were kind of taking us back and parsing the Zeitenwende speech a little bit before bringing it to where we are today in the debate over which military hardware should be provided and when, I guess I've been reflecting a little bit on the Zeitenwende speech as well, and wonder if Scholz might have given a different speech if he had thought that the war would go on for such a long time. I think that the consensus in February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, was that this would be over pretty quickly, and not necessarily that it would drag on as long as it has, not necessarily that the Ukrainians would show this level of tenacity in fighting back. And so I wonder if sort of that's something that you've thought at all about.
I think he would have given the same speech. I'll tell you why, because if it had been over faster, it would have been on the Russian terms. Zeitenwende was really, he was addressing a German and a Western European audience, saying really what changed is we fooled ourselves by thinking Russia is not a threat, and that there in fact are no threats at all, and that we can just be a mercantile commercial nation. And the speech was about, no, we have to take care of ourselves, of our own army for our own defense and security, but also as allies. And if Putin were already in Kiev now, that the case for that would be even larger, right? So all of that, Sweden, Finland trying to join NATO, the Baltic nations, Moldova, it feels threatened. So in that sense, I think he understood there is a real threat, and we have to face it, say it, and act in accordance with that, which is the opposite of what we'd done for 20 years before. So in that sense, I think it was, he would have probably said the same thing. I think it's one of the two great speeches of 2022. The other, I was even thinking but I was on holiday on New Year's Eve. The other being Zelensky's New Year's address. I don't know if you saw that. Incredibly moving.
Yeah.
Olaf Scholz is not a rhetorical genius. Zelensky, in some ways, I think he is a great communicator. But I almost compared to Pericles' funeral oration, Gettysburg Address, Churchill speeches. These are speeches that will enter the canon when we study history. Scholz, because he gave a name to the turning point.
Yeah.
Zelensky, because he called out this enormous bravery and sacrifice, which is the other thing about the new era, because heroism and stuff sounded so, not just old-fashioned, it sounded outdated, and the Germans, the intellectuals, they would laugh at that because they were post-nationalist, they had learned that. And I think that kind of spirit of sacrifice and stuff is back, and that's the Zelensky speech. So between these two speeches, that captured, I think, what happened in 2022. And this year we'll find out, well, whether it escalates, whether it becomes a long stalemate, what the future holds for Russia and all these other countries. One other thing where I'll say, I'm always, as a journalist, happier criticizing any government, and particularly this party that he leads, but I must be fair to Scholz. And another thing that he's done well, because he was the host of the G7, and Indonesia last year hosted the G20. But he understood from the beginning that he was trying, I think, more effectively than any other Western leader, to prevent this from becoming a Russia versus the West. He wanted to turn it into Russia versus the world, the democracies, the civilized, the decent countries. And he realized that the issue was Indonesia, India, Senegal, these countries. And he did incredible behind the scenes outreach with Annalena Baerbock and others, but that I think he also, I would give him one more piece of praise, because I think he also helped get Xi Jinping of China to nudge him to the right side. He claims to be friends and partners with Putin, of course, but Xi Jinping didn't expect Putin to invade, didn't expect it to go so badly, didn't expect Putin to go to make these outrageous nuclear threats. And I think Xi and Modi in India, they've been making clear to Putin, don't go there. We're not gonna, we're gonna be kind of neutral or friendly for now, but don't take it any further. And Olaf Scholz was in several, he went to, Beijing at one point, did play a role in that. So I give him some credit for that as well.
Yeah. So thanks for highlighting these sort of positive signs of leadership, as you might describe it when you look at Olaf Scholz, because I thought it was interesting earlier in our conversation. You said that Germany is not on the front line in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's in the second line, and that there are expectations that Germany should be more of a leader. You also then said, as we were talking about the tank issue or the infantry fighting vehicles, that when Germany's allies take a step, Germany follows as well. One of our viewers points out that the Zeitenwende speech was sort of a message, and it was great rhetoric, but it wasn't necessarily a strategy. And this viewer goes on to say that Germany is finding it difficult to break its old habits and truly take on a leadership role, and asks, why is Olaf Scholz failing to lead?
As I said, I don't think he's failing to lead. What you have is a different problem, which the viewer, I agree with you, viewer, that Germany has always been a problematic place. Okay, you know that, Stephen, and is a country that does Alleingänge, that goes it alone. It is part of that solipsism. They don't understand. For instance, we could talk, but I recommend to everyone the great course on YouTube at Yale by Timothy Snyder on Ukraine. He talks a lot about Germany in this, and the weird deal between Moscow and Germany, that atonement for the past was focused on the center, on Moscow, on Russia, when in fact the bloodlands, as he calls them, were Ukraine, were Poland, were the Baltic nations, were Belarus, you know? So the Germans have had this distorted view of the past, which they misinterpreted as giving them a special responsibility toward Moscow, as opposed toward the whole region. And, you know, and these other things, this post-nationalist illusion. And so, but really, and then there's a special factor of the East Germans. So, you know, if Olaf Scholz were just leading the old West Germany, it would be a different story again. And so you have, and then the bizarre role of German intellectuals of that class. You know, there are specific philosophers writing open letters all the time, and well-known philosophers. And so they sort of are in their own either ivory tower or la la land. And to bring such a complex society along is much harder than for Kallas in Estonia, or for Finland, or for these more homogeneous, directly threatened countries. Of course, they're gonna be easy to lead. But Olaf Scholz knew that he has to be there, didn't want to forge ahead of the Americans, not be too far behind either, and also genuinely didn't know. Are we, you know, at various points last year, we thought we could have nuclear explosions. Yes, I do want him to lead much more firmly. And as I said, in the summer, I started saying, send those Leopard 2 tanks, all of that, show your hand. Belatedly, by the way, the Frank-Walter Steinmeier is the head of state, the nominal, you know, the president. That's he's a symbol for that old, failed German approach to everything, in particular Russia, and that was a side plot. So, you know, in that background and in that party, I think he did relatively well. But where the viewer is right is that Germany is complex. And I wouldn't predict, if this goes on for 10 years, where Germany, not Scholz, would be in 5 years and 10 years, you know? And of course, to be fair, we have to say there are a lot of other very important problematic countries as well. I'm thinking especially of Turkey, questionable ally. Poland, which is having an election this year, sort of came back into the fold, realized that the European Union and the West wasn't all that bad. You know, they'll need us, even though they're running an election campaign against Germany and with calling for war reparations and the ugly German and all that. And then other problematic countries, there are Hungary, and then some countries could become problematic, you know? And I think, but what I think Scholz and his government has realized, that that's why Germany does have to step up and lead, at least within Europe. And I'd give him a B minus maybe, but not an A, but not a C. I think as far as that goes, nothing else. But as far as that goes, he's passed so far.
Well, and I think that there are great expectations that he'll step up in the year ahead. Right. I mean, I think that there are some opportunities in the year ahead for him to do that. I'd like to maybe switch gears a little bit and come back to something that we touched on very briefly, but that's related to all of this, Obviously, because of the war in Ukraine, Germany has been forced into a real energy conundrum. And while we've seen a debate playing out over military spending and the provision of military equipment to Ukraine, there's also been a debate playing out about energy, and there have been huge concerns about whether or not Germany would get through this winter, whether it would get through next winter. Of course, so far this has been a relatively mild winter, and the gas reserves were very high as of November already. But we saw in the fall, and this is a question that one of our viewers has, we saw in the fall that energy prices were, a very important political issue in Germany and in Europe. And this viewer who's based in New York writes, it looks as though Germany will weather this winter with enough gas in its reservoirs. But are energy prices still a political issue? And how is the public dealing with issues around inflation and slow growth?
Energy prices have come back down part way, and therefore are less of an issue. The same, by the way, is true for inflation. Okay, so that doesn't mean they stay down. We can't predict anything anymore, but they may not define 2023 as they define 2022. You said a relatively mild winter. I'm sitting here in Berlin and there are birds chirping. Okay, I put on the sweater mainly to look good for you, Steve, but I didn't need it. It's not a relatively mild, it's like a record for large parts of Europe. It's bizarre. So climate change kind of bailed us out of this one. So this, and on top of that, about Habeck, we've talked in our previous Kaffeepause, we've talked about his sort of, he's an interesting one, his fortunes going up and down as well. But one thing that Germany has done is to correct for these disastrous 2 decades of Russian gas pipelines by building in record speed 3 floating LNG, liquefied natural gas terminals, of which the first is in operation and the other 2 are coming online, and that's just part of the plans. Norway is sending LNG, so it gets controversial. Habeck went to Qatar and kind of curtsied and stuff. So they're diversifying. It's especially hard for the Greens, but for all of them, because they brought coal-fired plants back online, because they're also phasing out the nuclear plants, which is, so you see, again, it's that they're in a way, they're the ones having to fix decades of very misguided German energy policy. The simultaneous exit from coal and nuclear does not make sense, should not happen, okay? Many of these other things, which again, the German solipsism, where they would lecture anybody, but everyone else thought about the nuclear issue, they were crazy. And they're, of course, building out wind and solar as fast as they can, but that'll never save them, because sometimes there's neither sun nor wind and all these things. But right now, for now, the LNG terminals plus the record mild weather has saved them. And as a result, energy prices are down again. We're not taking very cold showers, or it's not very cold. We don't know what will happen next winter, but we're rethinking the entire thing. So, I think that political storm, because they passed various relief measures. I saw very interesting polling there. This is very German. They made them so complex that no one understood them. As a result, no one in the polls gives the government credit for any of them. Some of them haven't arrived yet, but no one even understand what the different parts of this puzzle are. But they're trying to give some people relief with their bills, starting especially now, and that's not going to bring them down. In the bigger scheme of things, I also think it's not top of mind for me, because the Ukrainians are giving their lives in their cities and they have no electricity at all, and they're losing their children, and and they're asking us to, save a bit on energy. I always thought this was overdone, but because of the mild weather and the prices going down, I think the worst is over for the time being.
Mm-hmm. But let me sort of maybe parse the question a little bit. I mean, this is obviously how residential customers and residential consumers have been navigating the energy crisis, and where there's been a rise in prices, where there's been concern. But there's also the industry side, or the business side of things. And I'm wondering whether you think that the business sector has learned some important lessons from the energy shortages and energy concerns that were experienced last year, and is thinking differently about its energy consumption moving forward as well.
Definitely. I mean, for the chemical companies, this was existential. They need a lot of natural gas for their operations. For the car companies, to some extent, they've saved a lot. I think in terms of recession, it won't get as bad as we thought. Everything won't get as bad as we thought quarter of a year ago. But in terms of, there's a lot of, if you like, Fust and Zinn at the IFO Institute and stuff, the buzzword now is, one buzzword is business model Germany. Does Germany have to rethink its economic model as a whole? This export-driven manufacturing powerhouse, energy hungry, and very open in terms of trade to, international trade and stuff. Another part of that is because they sort of so obviously were shown to be wrong this year about the last 2 decades of Russian energy policy. People are saying, well, therefore, let's rethink what during the same 2 decades, how we viewed China and the dependencies we have allowed to accumulate there. They're different, they're not pipelines, but from export markets for Volkswagen to inputs and supply chains, I think the whole world realized, oops, we got a problem there. We had supply chain problems. But specifically, again, for the Germans, if you're thinking, okay, the next crisis could be Taiwan or something, where is that going to leave us? They realized, okay, for instance, my column out this morning was about rare earths. And I think the title meant to be cheeky. China has the dysprosium, and that's a problem, But China has almost all the, something like 80 to 90% of the world's rare earths, which go into these super magnets that you need for electric cars, for the wind turbines that they need, but also for everything else, like the hard drive. And so the German business and industry is discovering new vulnerabilities, dependencies, and going, oops, it's worse than we thought. So let's try to get out of the first, that's Russian gas, and simultaneously let's diversify a bit for the next. And that together, that mixes. And I think a lot of German business tycoons in that crowd, they're discussing the future of the German business model, which is probably of great interest to your audience. And I think that too, as part of Zeitenwende, there is a big question mark over that. If you add demographics, the aging population, and the other known challenges that Germany has to this, whoa, yeah, that's going to be very different,
So related to this conversation about China, one of our viewers is curious whether you think that Germany's position on China will become more hawkish this year.
It has. In part because of Annalena Baerbock of the Greens,
who came in with a much more hawkish position on China.
Because that, again, is part of this green evolution towards this hyper idealist, almost moralistic party. And yes, even before the war, she was against, unusually in German politics, against Nord Stream 2. And so was Habeck, by the way, and also sounding hawkish on China. And it is a natural sort of consequence of the West pulling together and of Scholz in that larger leadership role that we talked about, of trying to hold a fractious alliance together, of not falling out of line. And for the Americans, the priority is China, since Obama's pivot from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the Germans have figured out, along with some other Americans, like, okay, we got to sort of help the Americans do that pivot by doing our part. We can't expect them to ride to our rescue if we don't take their security concerns. So that's part of it too. But also China. I also think that Baerbock genuinely cares about things like the some think tank calls it a genocide in Xinjiang and things like that. They are a moralizing party that can be good and bad. But so that, yes, there is a more hawkish tone in Germany and in the whole European Union. China had something called 16+1, which became 17+1, which is now, I think, 13 or something +1. They wanted to get the Eastern European and Central European and Southern European countries basically into their Belt and Road project, and they've all lost interest. And that started with Lithuania. Mm-hmm. They put the label Taiwan Trade Office on some representative office, and then China, with its what are they have a word for that, diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy, came down like a ton of bricks and banned all trade with Lithuania and stuff. And the European Union, I think, said, no, we got to stand with Lithuania. So, and hence you have interesting things like Zimmermann now visiting Taiwan. So it's essentially saying, we're talking to China also to help them stand down Putin. It's complex triangulation, mm-hmm. but also we're not going to let you bully us, and we're also not going to make the same mistakes that we made with Russia, right? We're not going to become so dependent that that's just the next problem that'll then really mm-hmm. impoverish us.
So, Andreas, as we come to an end here, and as you look ahead to this year, obviously issues like the war in Ukraine, relations with China, energy, possibly topics like migration policy, which we've not talked about, but which seems to be in a number of headlines in the German press at the moment, are issues that will sort of dominate the debate moving forward. And I guess sort of one closing question that I would have for you is what are the topics that you would encourage our viewers to follow in the months ahead as being important issues for German politics? But the other one, and I think that these are related, is there are 4 regional elections in Germany and more than half a dozen national elections in Europe slated for this year. How do you think that these elections will impact German politics?
In terms of this year, this is banal, but the war and the actual developments, which are impossible to foresee, if you think back a year ago, where we thought we might be now, will determine everything. If you think of scenarios like, what if he did drop a tactical nuclear weapon? What if Putin is gone? What if there's a revolution? What if Russia breaks apart? What if Russia wins against all? That will determine everything else. And against that, we have a lot of scheduled events, of which I think the 4 regional elections in Germany are the least important. But I will mention them. But there are many, and I actually looked at a list of elections from Pakistan and everything that could play a big role. The most important, I think, will be in Turkey, because Erdogan is such a problem, not just Sweden and Turkey, and so important in this chess game with Putin, that maybe once that election is over, depending on that he will either not have to do his vandalism, his diplomatic vandalism to that extent, threatening Greece and all of these things, or he'll be gone, And then in the fall, Poland because Poland has been with Hungary sort of the rotten core of the European Union. Gumming up its machines. Okay, the EU couldn't do anything anymore with Poland and Hungary doing that, and I think we may. And so therefore, that's another potential. It could go one way or the other, but we will see. At least the election will be over, and they will stop doing their anti-German and anti-Brussels campaigning, and they might just be gone, and then maybe a more pro-EU government will be in. And Spain and others, and of course, Ukraine has, by the way, an election too. So in that context, Germany, there are always elections in Germany, as you know. That's the part of the system. Berlin is having one next month. That's a joke, because it just had one and it screwed it up, but not in a kind of like January 6th way, like fraud or anything. It just, Berlin is governed by the lefties, and they're famous for screwing everything up. You can't get your passport renewed. They can't hold the election, so they're redoing it.
There was a technicality.
Yeah, and then there's Bremen, which I think your audience can safely sit out. It's another basically lefty. It's West German city-state, quite unusual. And then later in the year, Hesse region around Frankfurt, and then Bavaria, which is a special. And there you'll see, but that is the importance of those two will be domestic. People will read that for, will the governor, the premier of Bavaria, Markus Söder, will he do very well or just okay? Will he try to become the candidate for chancellor again next time? He kind of ruined it for the guy who was the candidate last time. These things. And there too, they're going to take their cues from the situation, but the importance of those will be domestic, and almost, I mean, there's nothing we can, all these other bigger things will come into play. If we have enough energy and the war doesn't escalate, then we'll be in one place. If it does escalate, or even when it will be in another place. But so Bavaria, Bavaria and Hesse will be the ones to watch. Maybe we can meet again around that time, and we'll know something. But really, I think, like stay up late or wake up early the day after Turkey's election, because that'll tell us something about NATO, about Greece, about the European Union, about all these things, all those things you mentioned, migrants. Erdogan, like Lukashenko, likes to herd them towards the EU. So a lot of these things are connected, as we saw in Brazil yesterday with the storm, And Germany, in that context, is actually one of the most orderly places in the world right now, right? If you think of it in that terms, and that's something,
Well, Andreas, thank you so much for spending this time with us. This has been a wonderful way to start the year and sort of get your lay of the land in terms of how Germany is faring both domestically, but also on the world stage as it deals with myriad challenges that we're all facing. And I wish you once again a happy new year, and hope that we have an opportunity to speak again in the not too distant future.
I can't wait. Thank you very much for having me back.
Okay, take care.
Take care.